Again, I'm going to welcome you. This is a Vintage Bentonville presentation on the history of Bentonville from the 1950s. You look at Bentonville back then and what you think of as, or at least what I think of as Mayberry RFD, the television show that we all used to watch. I think of it as a little community where kids could run around. Parents wouldn't worry about them. If you did get in trouble, everybody in town knew about it. Everybody knew everybody. And that's the feeling I get about Bentonville from the 1950s. Some of the pictures that we see are pictures of people you might see back in the 1950s. This is probably the Garden Club, beautifying the Bentonville Square at that point in time. Now the sign, I wish we had this sign today. It's a beautiful sign that welcomed people to Bentonville. I think it was on the location, what they call Tooth Acres, just before you would turn on 71 Business today, where that was located. And I will say most of you here probably could do this a lot better than I could because you've lived here during this period of time. This is the Methodist Church. During the 1950s, 1953, they laid the cornerstone for the church. In the cornerstone itself, they put the history of the church, put church documents, pictures of the beginning of the church from the first church. And there were several churches built. Seems like the Methodists had a problem with churches burning down off and on regularly during the early period of time. In 1954, in January 1954, the church was completed at a cost of $350,000. Now here's a picture looking down South A Street. This Burger Mortar Company off to your right. And then you can kind of see the First Baptist Church building down the street a little bit. And I love the angle parking that you don't see today. It'll kind of... interesting picture of a house being moved down the middle of West Central Street. What's really interesting in this picture is what I'm seeing are the signs. You have McKinney Furniture Store off to your right. You have Crow Drug Store down there. And kind of gives you a glimpse of what Bentonville looked like 60 years ago. This was the inside of McKinney Furniture back then. I love the appliances. I wonder what a TV cost back at that point in time. Here's a picture of the plaza. Now the plaza was actually originally called the Metro. It later became the Plaza. It was owned by Charles Craig for a long time, and then it was sold to J.T. Hitt. And J.T. Hitt worked in the theater for many, many years under Mr. Craig. And at one time, Mr. Hitt owned all three theaters in town. The Plaza, the... help me, folks. The what? Cozy and Park. He owned all three of those at one point in time. Now today, this is a vacant lot. This is Darren's Furniture that sat next to the Plaza Theater. The one interesting thing is it seems like anything they built on that site eventually burns. Because back in 1930s, Stokes Motor Company was built on the same location. That building also burns. They rebuilt it as Darren's Furniture, and in the early 1960s, it burned. It was Darren Furniture at this point in time back in around, they bought it in 1956. It later became Miller Furniture and the Millers owned it until the 1960s. What happened to the building eventually? It caught on fire. And nothing has been rebuilt on that property since the fire back in, it was in 1961. So we talk about pictures being the 1950s. We kind of fudged a little bit and threw this one in. Now some of these buildings, this is a 1950s photograph, but you got to remember some of the history of Bentonville goes clear back. This building was built in 1911. This was built by A.O. Clark, who was a well-known architect here in town. What are some of the things that have been in this building over time? Library. City Hall. Court. City Council chambers. Been in there. Library. City utilities were in there. And my understanding, it started off as Benton County National Bank when it was first built. How many of you knew that there was a shooting gallery in there at one point in time? Sometime between two banks, or between a bank and the city buying the property, there was a shooting gallery in there temporarily. Also, KAMO used to do live programs on the front porch of the old City Hall building. I bet you few of you remember these. Police officers in the 1950s. From right to the left, Truman Bowling. Hugh Tater Black is the second one. Wilson Wallace. Oops. And John Cox. And John Cox, if I'm correct, was the city meter man. For the longest time, he had no gun. But I guess eventually they kind of broke down and gave him a .22 revolver to carry around with him.
So was this the whole police department?
This was the whole police department.
What year?
It was in the 1950s. I don't have a specific... What?
There was only
Four. You got to remember, Bentonville was not a very big town back at that point in time. There was a switch off of a lot of officers over the years. Tater, I think, became sheriff. I think Wilson Wallace went on to be with the Arkansas Highway Patrol. Gary Black. The Blacks know this building too well. I'm sorry, earlier I said the bank building was built in 1911. It was actually built in 1908. This was the building that was built in 1911. This building came about being built because of an incident that happened in another jail previously to the time this was built. There was a fire that sat behind, or a jail that sat behind the old courthouse on the northwest corner of the square. And what they did was they just locked the prisoners up at night, and there was no jailer or anything that would stay with them overnight. They would just be in the jail. Well, at one point in time, fire broke out in the jail. And there was nobody there to let the prisoners out, and two of the prisoners died in the fire, which led to a call for a jailhouse that would allow the jailer or the family or the sheriff and his family to live at the jail so that there would always be somebody present so there wouldn't be a situation like they had like that again. And a lot of times the jailer's wife or the sheriff's wife would end up cooking for the prisoners in the jail. Here's a gorgeous building, one of the prettiest buildings in Benton County at one point in time. This building was built in 1887. It was built, at the point in time, it was built as People's Bank. Watch my buttons. It was also robbed by Henry Starr in 1893. I hear when they lit up that neon light for the first time on the Bentonville Square, it just illuminated the whole square. It's something like Bentonville had never seen before when that neon sign first lit up. Today, Most of the glamour of the building has been taken away. A lot of it's being ground off. It's hardly recognizable to the building that we're seeing here. They have looked into the possibility, the owner has, of maybe trying to get it more back the way it was originally.
That brick's still there.
That's what I heard, but I've heard they ground down the brick's still there, but I've heard they ground down a lot of the fancier stuff that you see there. The Bank of Bentonville opened in 1951. Guess what the capital stock or the amount of money they had on hand when they opened the bank? Anybody have a guess? 20,000? It was more than 20,000. It was 3.5 million. But in this day and age, 3.5 million is not that much money. I don't know how many of you remember the inside of the bank. What we have here is on the left we have Ellen Jefferson, who was one of the cashiers. And on the right, we have Martha Ann Mason, who again worked at the bank. And most of you know it, that the bank just took up a sliver of that whole building that was there. And it used to be even the back portion of this bank when the building was first built was originally where Kit Carson started his barbershop. And that later became the Elkhorn barbershop. And then later he moved over to East Central Street. So the building wasn't that big. I think it was a little bit bigger at this point in time after the barbershop had moved. I don't know how many of you remember Jim Craig. He was Arkansas Poultry, wasn't he? Am I correct? I think that's right. And what he's doing is he's pointing out a bullet hole in one of the pillars of the bank. And that was one of the bullet holes that were left by the bank robbery of Henry Starr, where the citizens of the city were shooting at the bandits and the bandits were shooting back, and there was just a melee of gunfire on that particular day. Here's the Elkhorn barbershop. Pictures taken in 1955. I'm sure that's the picture I've got here. Yes, it is. Okay, in this picture, we've got everybody identified. Over to the left, we have Jerry Cavness and Dennis Matthews. In the chair nearest the farthest, we have Paul Rice, Bill McReel, Joe Cavness, and Earl Davidson. Ray Davidson.
Who did you say this first kid was? Jerry
Casey?
Yeah, you did say it.
Okay. Jerry Casey was the first gentleman in the seat on the one side. And then on the barbers, nearest the farthest, was Harley Fields, Mr. Ruth, John Mayhall, and Mr. Nass. Now, the Elkhorn barbershop was a really interesting place, and I've had the opportunity to purchase a few of the items that originally had been in there. The barbershop itself had over 20 heads of mounted elk and deer, and they came from Jack Bates. Jack Bates was a local banker, not Banks, Bates. And he provided the deer heads for the Elkhorn barbershop that they had on display. Also, they had a lot of Civil War items. They had swords and had a lot of early pictures from the 1880s and 1870s of Bentonville. And they had some old advertising mirrors. I don't know if you can see the old advertising mirrors in the background. Those advertising mirrors were put out, the best I can figure out, from between 1910 and 1920. And those advertising mirrors sit in my garage today.
Is Is that the barbershop that was on Central?
East Central.
East Central?
You're right, where the convention center is today. The second building on East.
That didn't become Gene's barbershop, did it?
No, Gene's was on West Central.
Okay, so East.
But it was, if you know where the convention center is, it's the second door down on East Central. Okay. That's where the Elkhorn barbershop was. Now, there was quite a collection of shaving mugs, and every gentleman who came in to be shaved at that point in time would have their own shaving mugs. Well, the collection started with Kit Campbell, way back when. And it continued through Harley Fields, and then Charlie Turner, who still barbers down on Main Street, took over, and he collected some more. There was 2 racks that each held 80 mugs, so there was 160 shaving mugs. That's part of the second one in that shop. Now here's a picture, and this just kind of shows you the people who were there. There's a C.M. Rice, Charles Rice, who was a well-known attorney in town. He was related to the Peel family. Vol Lindsay, again, he was an attorney here in town. John Lee, and many of you may not know much about this, but he was the conductor, or not the conductor, the engineer for the Rogers Southwestern Railroad. And you go, Rogers Southwestern Railroad. Where was that? Well, that ran from Rogers to Cave Springs, through Springtown, over to Siloam Springs. And it only ran for about 14 years. At World War I started, the line was taken up and that line was deserted. Also, W.T. Haxton, he owned a hardware store in town. And this is just a fraction of the mugs that we see that were collected at that time. This was the Kroger's grocery store. If I'm correct, it wasn't it next door to the Elkhorn barbershop. And I don't know about you, but I'd sure love to pay 33 cents a pound for a ground beef today. And I think it's quite interesting to look at some of the prices that were back then compared to what we have to pay today for the same food. I'd like to see what their steaks cost. How many of you know this gentleman? He ran a business in downtown for years and years. This is Roy Scroggins of Roy's Office Supply. When he was maybe a little bit younger man than what a lot of you remember him as now. This is M&J Variety Store. It sat on the northwest corner of the square, kind of on the north side of the square, but right on the corner there. It was ran by the Niemeyers for quite a while, and then it was later taken over by Myra and Jack Hayes. And Myra worked for the Niemeyers for quite a while before she purchased the building. Little's IGA. Again, I think it sat in the same buildings as what later M&J sat in. The people you see in this picture, left to right, are Madden Pierce, Bonita Little, Jasper Little, who was the owner of the store, and then the next person is also Jasper Little. But Jasper Little was better known as Jappy. This is what the interior of the store looked like way back when. I don't know about you. I just had to check the price of Velveeta cheese. It's 69 cents. I worked in food stores when I was young, and I remember they would have it on sale for 99 cents. So I got online and looked at Walmart. How much do you think Velveeta cheese runs today?
It's $7 something.
Well, what I found it for was $4.89. The county vault building. This building was built in 1889. It was built at the cost of just about $5,000, and it held the circuit clerk and county clerk's office. But as a lot of you know it, Williams Bakery was in there. The Pratts had a sports shop in there. There was an insurance agency in there. It was at that location until the 1960s when the Waltons were building Midtown Center, and at that point in time, that building was torn down. I forgot to recognize. This is a picture from Jimmy Wright. This was Jimmy's Cafe. It also was the bus depot, the taxi station, the Western Union station. It was built in 1947, and it was bought by the Waltons in 1965. And the people you see out front are Cub Philbeck, Winnie Neal, Grace Hobbs, Georgia Perkins, and the last person we have not yet identified. But another note is at the far right side is Cheeks Salon that was run by Enola Marple.
Where was this building located?
This is where Midtown, on the square where Midtown Center is, the northwest corner of Bentonville Square. Been a lot of things on the northwest corner of the square, including a county courthouse at one point in time. Here we have Applegate's Pharmacy. This building was purchased in 1920 by John Applegate. He ran the business here for many, many years, almost 37 years. And his son, Joe, I guess helped in the store as soon as they could set a Coke box up and he could look over the counter. He started helping out in the store. Joe took over in 1940. Well, Joe talked about having to fill like 5,000 capsules for Dr. Hurley for his medical office. And did little menial tasks like that. Cokes there used to cost 5 cents. Joe took over in 1945 after his father had some health issues. And this stayed on this corner until 1957. Now, the other interesting things is what's in the background there. What you're seeing is now Midtown Center, and you're seeing Rakestraw's dry goods store back there, and also the Bentonville Hotel. In 1957, Applegate's moved to a new location. At that point in time, it moved to 113 North Main, which would today be like the Arvest meeting room. When they first opened up, they had free coffee, free ice cream, and free balloons for the kids. And one unique thing about the store at that point in time in 1957 is it had air conditioning, which was very rare at that point in time. Here's a picture of Joe Applegate as he was in his new store. And at that point in time, Mabel ran the cosmetic counter in the store. Here we have Melvin Rakestraw. And I don't know how many of you know Leon Rose. The Kiwanis put on something called the Heifer program quite often, where businessmen would give a farming kid a heifer to get his own herd started. Again, a pretty good shot of Rakestraw's dry goods store and the Bentonville Hotel. Now this next picture really has not changed much over the years. Wrong picture. Sorry, a couple more pictures down the road and I'll say that again. This was a Benton County Fair parade. What happened this year is a bunch of people from Carthage decided to drive their wagons down for the Benton County Fair. So they started off, made it to Pea Ridge, the night before. They camped in Pea Ridge, and the next day they came in and were part of the Benton County Fair Parade for that particular year. A couple things to notice is the Cozy Theater sign in the background. Cozy Theater sign, as most of you probably know, had a strawberry basket on the top, and it had strawberries that cascaded down the side of the sign. Really unusual sign. This is again Benton County Fair Parade, but you have Walton 5 and Dime in the background. The store in the middle, although there's not much signage on it, at that point in time was probably the Bentonville Cash Store, run by Burke and Benita Dudley. And the float is the Welcome Wagon. It's kind of hard to see there, but Welcome Wagon Bentonville. There's the one I said really hasn't changed much over the years.
So the Cozy is where the Station Cafe
is. Where the Station Cafe is.
Theater?
Yeah, and the thing is, the screen was against the front of the building. So you go in and you sit at the back of the building and look towards the front of the building where the screen was. And if I'm wrong on anything, guys, correct me. But this pretty much still looks the same as it did back then. And most of you probably know this guy if you recognize him as being this young. I think these were a couple Chamber of Commerce pictures taken of Sam Walton way back when. Sam Walton moved here, we'll say he went to the University of Missouri. He worked for J.C. Penney's up until World War II, and then World War II he joined the Army. He opened a store in Newport, Arkansas, and something happened. I think the store did too well, and the lease ran out, and they didn't renew the lease because the gentleman who owned the store wanted to put something in there in place of it. So Sam Walton moved up here, and he bought out 3 stores that sit where the Walton store sits now. They were, I think, Harrison's barbershop, Harrison's 5 and Dime. There was also a barbershop, and I forget what the 3rd store was at that point in time. But he opened up in Bentonville in 1962. By 1965, he had 15 stores, and then the rest is kind of history from there. The Zesto. Now a parking lot behind the Massey, but most people know this as the Zesto or the Dario. It opened in June of 1953. It was originally owned by Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Miller. And then later on, it was bought by Mr. Ed Owens, and that's when it became the Dario. And some of the things I've heard that they were famous for was their Frito pies and orange slushies. Ray Davidson's DX station. It was in the corner of Central and A Street. Grand opening of the station was June of 1950. I think the family's dog's underneath the car, if I'm correct. What was the dog's name? Spot. Okay. And that's your dad's car too, isn't it? That Spot's under, or is it at the pump? Where's your dad's car in this picture?
That's Dad's car.
Is it?
That's Dad putting gas in the car.
Okay. Is your dad putting gas in his car? Bentonville Fire Department. It opened up in December 1962. They held an open house at that time, and it had 1,000 residents come out to view the new fire department at that time. There was 4,500 square feet in this building. It had room for 3 full-time firemen to live here at that point in time. The majority of the other people at that point in time were volunteer firemen who would just serve whenever a fire occurred. White's Cafe. It was at 406 Southwest A. I think previously it had been the 700 block. of A Street, but moved to 406. And again, had some. I love looking at the prices of the old menus. I have some pictures of the interior of this, but I didn't put them in this presentation. Bentonville Canning Company. This building was actually built in 1926. At that point in time, it was called the Mid-Mountain Canning Company. In 1936, it was bought out by a group of local investors. It was changed to Bentonville Canning Company. And it stayed in operation as a canning company until 1954. At that point in time, it became Western Byproducts, which did something with feathers. I'm assuming it made pillows. But in May of 1960, the building caught on fire. And apparently it was quite a fire. It had 3 Bentonville fire trucks that were called, and they called in 2 more fire trucks from Rogers. And they had Springdale fire trucks standing by just in case there was a fire in either Bentonville or Rogers during that period of time. Southside Grocery Store. This was at 709 Southwest A Street. It was owned by John and Maud Taylor. And since Larry Joe didn't show up today, I'm going to tell a story about Larry Joe. Apparently, they let Larry Joe give out Pepsis when Pepsi and Coke were in such competition. Larry Joe would hand out Pepsis to all the customers who came in the store for free. And his pay for doing that was all the Pepsi he could drink. Well, he drank so much Pepsi, to this day, he still will not drink Pepsi. Yeah. That's what Larry Joe gets for not showing up tonight. Caulfield's Grocery Store was located at 610 Southwest A Street. It's still there today. At this point in time, it was a big supermarket for its time. If you went into the store, the meat cutter you'd probably meet was Wayne Caulfield, and the checker was probably Mildred Potts. And beside it was a drive-in cleaner that was run by Bill Fields. Now, I don't have much to say about this picture, but it's a picture on South Main, looking back north. You can kind of see where the old Masonic Lodge was. Putman's men's store in the ground, and then the corner drug store at that point in time. A little bit better picture of where the Masonic Lodge was. The Masonic Lodge was in the upstairs of this building at this point in time. At this time, Best Laundry Cleaners was in the location, but if you look up above, you can see where Beck's Laundry Cleaners were in this building also. This building, you might see, it's much, much prettier today than it was when this picture was taken. 113 South Main Street. At that point in time, it was Wellborn's barbershop. And 115, there was a shoe repair shop, and 117 was the Maid-Rite. Now, the Wellborn's barbershop, from what I'm told, would charge 35 cents to cut your hair. Harley Fields would charge 50 cents to cut your hair. But most mothers wanted their kids to go to Harley Fields because the haircuts were quite obviously different. And there was a story of one time when somebody went to put a coin in a weight machine and they put in the wrong coin. They didn't have enough money to go to Harley Fields to get their hair cut. So they went to Wellborn's barbershop, and when the child got home, the mom looked at the child and goes, "What did Harley do to you?" Again, a picture on South Main Street. You have Allen's or Bentonville Grocery Store at that point in time. You have Mitchell Lumber, which later became, I think, Gilstrap Lumber. That building, I'm not sure if it's totally been replaced, but it's a one-story building today. The old Burns Funeral Home. This picture was taken in 1958. The old funeral carriage was built in 1865, and it was driven in the 1958 County Fair Parade. And afterwards, the horse-driven hearse was brought back to the funeral home. It said they had 200 people show up to take a look at the hearse, and the hearse was sitting on the hearse is Bob Burns driving it.
Where was that located?
Do you know where First Baptist Youth or Administration Building is now? That's where that building was located. Okay, what you're seeing in the background is the courthouse. This was the American Legion Hall at that point in time. The American Legion was started in Bentonville in 1919 by Jeff Rice. This building was built in 1934 by the Civil Works Administration. This building was not only used for the American Legion Hall, but it was a place for many dances. A lot of people would rent the facilities for whatever party, and I think sometimes on snow days they would rent the building just so all the kids had a place to go on a snow day. Now this is R.E. Baker School. They started construction on R.E. Baker School in July of 1950. They finished it December 9th, 1951. I don't know how many of you remember Albert Anderson. He was the moving person in town. But they had an open house December 9th, 1951, and they had 1,500 people show up for the dedication of the school. The building was 170 feet by 70 feet at that point in time. It only housed 3 grades, and it cost the city $78,000 to build the school. There was 8 classrooms, health room, and office, and that's all they had. And the classroom sizes a lot of times were like 45 kids at that time, which the state would shut you down at this point in time.
Is that the same location that R.E. Baker is now?
Yes, but you're only seeing from like the office back east.
Okay.
This is another picture of the school, and you can kind of see where it ends. This would kind of be what would be the main entrance you would see today. Old High Middle School. Old High Middle School was built in 1928. Now, to my understanding, when they tore down the other schools in town to build Old High, they used the brick out of those schools for the foundation of the new schools. Now, some of these schools were built back in the 1850s. And there was some question whether the brick from the old schools would be good enough for the foundation of Old High. But Old High really hasn't seemed to have shifted that much. Now, if you see any semblance with this school, the same person who designed this school also designed Little Rock Central. This school housed all grades until 1951, when the first through third moved out into R.E. Baker School.
So this was the main school for the whole?
For the whole, yeah. What they said was you would enter to the right and you would exit to the left. And I think the right wing was the elementary wing, the middle was the junior high, and the left wing was the senior high. This was the old gymnasium. It was built in 1949. Now, there was many different structures there was a band room that was separate from the school. I think an agri building that was separate from the school. This is just one of the many buildings, but it was one of the larger buildings that was not attached to the actual Old High Middle or Old High School. Now these, to finish up, we're just going to do a few aerial photographs from the 1950s. And like I told you, some of these slide things that we're going to be putting on the museum site here very soon are actually these aerial photographs. So you can see what Bentonville looked like in the 1950s when this was here. What you see right now is the majority of what you see right there is now Midtown Center. This is probably taken from the water tower. Looking back into town. You can see the Massey right there, kind of center left. Some of these pictures, I wonder how they got back in the 1950s. I don't know whether somebody was flying an airplane that low over the ground or not. And here's kind of looking west over town. Now this picture has really drastically changed. We did a layover of this picture, and you see all that open land there? Back in the 1950s, that's all been filled in by Walmart buildings and all kinds of other industry at this point in time. An interstate runs through there.
It's that big building on the corner there.
The corner?
It's got the road behind it.
Is that tie?
That's where the old craft things.
Yeah. Okay. Craft plant. And there's a train line that used to run down pretty close to the center part of town. And you can kind of follow that line as it comes into town. That's the old fairgrounds. And that is the end of our presentation tonight. I hope this has brought back a few memories to y'all who've watched it.